The Oversight Committee exists to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers for what they know is important for how they decide. And in fact, our job is to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is our mission. I now would ask unanimous consent to read into the record statements from two witnesses who will not be available, but family of the victims of the 9/11 attack on Benghazi. Without objection, so ordered. First, a letter from Kate Doherty Quigley. And she says, in a letter to the ranking member and myself, "Thank you for your invitation to participate in the committee's September 19, 2013 hearing concerning the attacks on the U.S. facility on September 11, 2012, during which 4 Americans, including my brother Glenn Doherty, was killed. I am unable to do so, but submit for the committee's consideration the following questions concerning events that led to my brother's death in particular. I ask that because I am unaware of the answers, these questions have been provided. First, my understanding is that it took 8 hours for the rescue team from Tripoli to travel 200 miles to reach their destination in Benghazi, that there were no dedicated transportation assets in place, and that the team received no help getting through barriers like the Benghazi airport and checkpoints in that city. If this is correct, why was it so, given the urgency of the mission, recognizing the difficulty of what ifs, and that's the way it's written, I nevertheless ask, if those conditions had been different, would the outcome have been less tragic? Secondly, Glenn lived his life to the fullest and took pride in teaching others how to be their best. Glenn died serving with men he respected, protecting the freedoms we enjoy as Americans, and doing something he loved. He is an American hero to those who did not know him, but for those of us who did know him, he is a best friend who leaves behind a giant hole in our hearts. My thanks go out to those in Congress and the administration who strive to learn what mistakes were made that night so that U.S. personnel can be better protected in the future. And it's signed Kate Doherty Quigley. Secondly, a letter that is signed from Chris Stevens' family. Chris Stevens died in the service of his country. He died doing what he loved most, working to build bridges of understanding and mutual respect between the people of the United States and the people of the Middle East and North Africa. He was loved by many more Libyans than those who hated him for being an American. A few dozen fanatics penetrated his compound, but more than 30,000 people in Benghazi demonstrated in protest over his death. Chris was successful because he embodied the traits that have always endeared Americans to the world: a commitment to democratic principles and respect for others regardless of race, religion, or culture. Chris regarded and liked each person he met as an individual. He respected their views whether or not he agreed. One of his friends told us a tale that reflects his success on a small scale. Picnicking in Libyan countryside, they met a local family. Chris immediately greeted them and suggested that they be photographed together. the young son of the patriarch of the family, suspiciously and negative toward Americans, refused to participate. So Chris continued chatting with the others. When it was time to leave, the initially suspicious son presented Chris with a bouquet of flowers, saying, "This is because you were so respectful to my father," he said. Chris was not willing to be the kind of diplomat who would strut around in fortified compounds. He amazed and impressed the Libyans by walking the streets with the lightest of escorts, sitting in sidewalk cafes, chatting with passers-by. There was a risk to being accessible. He knew it, and he accepted it. What Chris would never have accepted was the idea that his death would be used for political purposes. There were security shortcomings, no doubt. Both internal and outside investigations have identified and publicly disclosed them. Steps are being taken to prevent their reoccurrence. Chris would not have wanted to be remembered as a victim. Chris knew and accepted that he was working under dangerous circumstances. He did so just as so many of our diplomats and development professionals do every day, because he believed the work was vitally important. He would have wanted the critical work he was doing to build bridges of mutual understanding and respect, the kind of work that made him literally thousands of friends and admirers across the broader Middle East, to continue. So rather than engage in endless recriminations, his family is working to continue building bridges he so successfully began. 1 year ago this week, in response to tremendous outpouring of support from around the world, we launched the J. Christopher Stevens Fund. The mission of the fund is to support activities that build bridges between the people of the United States and those of the broader Middle East. This was the mission to which Chris dedicated his life. We are grateful to each contribution received from friends and family, from the government of Libya, and from people near and far moved by Chris and his story. In the coming weeks and months, we will launch a number of innovative programs and initiatives. The focus of our activity is on young people, both here in America and across the Middle East and North Africa. Chris served in the Peace Corps in Morocco, and his death was felt acutely by the Peace Corps family. Last year, in response to numerous queries from returned Peace Corps volunteers during Peace Corps Week, we encouraged returned volunteers to fan out across America and speak with youth about their experience abroad. We are now working with the Peace Corps to expand their reach into schools and communities across the country. The Center for Middle East Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where Chris studied as an undergraduate, announced on September 11th the Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens Memorial Fund for Middle East Studies. Endowed by the J. Christopher Stevens Fund, our purpose is to encourage and inspire students in Middle Eastern and North African scholarship. In Piedmont, California, where Chris spent his teen years, the Piedmont Unified School District Board of Education has voted to name the Piedmont High School Library the Ambassador Christopher Stevens Memorial Library. Chris was inspired by Piedmont High School's motto, "Achieve the Honorable." Later this year, together with a coalition of public and private partners, we will launch the J. Christopher Stevens Virtual Exchange Initiative. This initiative will embrace the power of technology to fuel the largest ever-increasing increase in people-to-people exchanges between the United States and the broader Middle East, vastly increasing the number and diversity of youth who have a meaningful cross-cultural experience as part of their formative education, and reaching over 1 million youth by 2020. Later this year, the University of California Hastings College of Law, from which Chris graduated in 1989, will host the Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens Symposium. The event will emphasize law and public policy as used in the practice to advance global understanding and peace principles to which Chris was committed. There have been more awards bestowed and honors given to Chris's memory, than we would ever have thought possible. But as we've said before, we have received letters from thousands of people all over the world who were touched by Chris's example. His openness touched a chord in their hearts. Chris would have wanted to be remembered for that. Thank you, the family of Chris Stevens. And without objection, they'll both be placed in the record. Briefly, in my opening statement, today we want to both do our job as constitutional officers and be very cognizant of the wishes of the family. We will hear on the second panel from additional family members. Like the first, they both want answers to questions, and they want Chris's memory to be one of his diplomacy and his service. They don't want this to be a political football. The committee's primary obligation as the Oversight and Reform Committee is to do oversight leading to meaningful reform. Last week marked the 12th anniversary of the September 11th attacks on the United States. It marked the one-year anniversary of the terrorist attack on the diplomatic facility in Benghazi. The attack cost Americans their lives. Ambassador Christopher Stevens, State Department Information Officer Sean Smith, and 2 American security officers, former U.S. Navy SEAL Tyrone Wood and Glenn Doherty. Today, we honor their memories and their heroic service to our nation. We recognize also the family members of the fallen who are with us today are those who truly experienced that loss firsthand. Last October, Secretary Hillary Clinton convened the Accountability Review Board, or ARB, as required by law to examine the facts and circumstances surrounding the hideous attacks and the report findings and recommendations. The ARB report was delivered to Congress on December 18, 2012. While the ARB made some important findings, it also raised serious additional questions. First, the ARB structure, along with the State Department culture, raises questions about the extent to which it can be independent. Although it is a meaningful document, this committee has not been able to receive the background information, or were their recorded notes sufficient to allow for a true review of the review. As we convene this hearing, the committee down the hall, the Foreign Affairs Committee, has authored significant reforms in the form of legislation. Part of what we will do here today is to continue fueling the discovery process for that purpose. In preparation for today's hearing, the staff has prepared approximately a 100-page report, which is entitled Benghazi Attacks, Investigative Update, Interim Report on the Accountability Review Board. I ask unanimous consent it now be placed in the record. Do you have corresponding? Would you? Okay. It raises important questions on the review board process. Today, our panel includes distinguished former government officials who know firsthand how important this process is and who dedicated their lives to this public service. And we thank you for being here today. Any criticism of the accountability review process or the law passed by Congress in 1986 that created it should be cast on Congress and the process that they were asked to do, and not to the individuals who headed this. I believe that to the extent that the ARB was currently and traditionally used, it has done its job. Our criticism today is, was it the appropriate investigation? Was it complete? Did it have the processes necessary to do a thorough review? Did it have the authority to go beyond the State Department? Was the record such that it could be reviewed and reviewed again, as many tragic and large investigations will? I think we all understand that if the attack 12 years ago on 9/11/2001 had been reviewed through the accountability review process, it would not have been sufficient for the American people. Therefore, our investigation today and the subject of this hearing is to look at what could be done, what was learned through the ARB. And I want to thank Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen personally for their work. They made many reform suggestions. My understanding is all of them have been accepted. My understanding further is acceptance and implementation can be different. In particular, one of the questions that will not be answered today but undoubtedly will be asked is, if 4 individuals were held accountable and in testimony at least one was recommended for firing, why is it none lost a day's pay and all are back on the job? That is a question for the current administration and not one for this panel. Additionally, we are joined by Director Sullivan and Todd Kyle. Their review is a second review, and it is broader in nature than Benghazi. And it is important because one thing that America learned from the attacks on 9/11/2012 is that, in fact, the system failed the people who were in that compound in Benghazi. Without a doubt, there are problems within how decisions are made for security of our various diplomatic facilities throughout the world. I look forward particularly in that Director Sullivan has firsthand knowledge of primary protection of an individual such as an ambassador or the President of the United States. But he also understands that compounds and facilities, both pre-planned and ad hoc, such as a hotel that the President might be staying in, have to be taken as they are but made to work. That, for me, says a lot about the nature of our diplomatic facilities throughout the world. Diplomatic compounds that are Inman compliant need not be looked at in any great additional detail. They are, in fact, set back. They are, in fact, fortresses. The only thing that needs to happen in an Inman-compliant facility is for the rules and the procedures to be followed for them to be extremely secure. But the vast majority of consulates, offices, USAID facilities, and the like throughout the world are not Inman-compliant. In fact, our investigation has shown that a great many exceptions occur every day, if you will, waivers to what is supposed to be. Often this comes in the form of defining a facility in a way different than what it actually is. And a multi-country office has a different standard than a consulate or an embassy. But if, in fact, principal officers are there and the risk of attack is high, they must be looked at in that sense. So I, for one, believe that this interim report closes, and I hope it really will, the chapter on the service of Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen, because I believe their service, although limited to the rules of the ARB, has been honorable, and they have done the best they could under the rules that Congress gave them in 1986. And with that, I am going to ask unanimous consent that my entire opening statement be placed in the record, since I used so much time for the earlier reading. And I yield back, and I recognize the Ranking Member for his opening statement.